Hello and welcome to Dining with Death, where we discuss infamous cases of death and murder that have an element of food to them, and then I cook or sample the food from the case. I'm Stacy Lee. Let's begin. Your feelings about this story are very much going to be affected by your perspective. If you're a woman who has ever had some other woman come after your husband, you might be inclined to feel a certain way about this case, and I would completely understand if you did. But even if you are so inclined, I doubt you'll be okay with how this case ended up. Heather Elvis was a native of Horry County, South Carolina. She graduated from St. James High School in 2011, and she moved out into her own apartment shortly after graduating. She had a roommate at the time, and she was working at the Tilted Kilt in Myrtle Beach, as well as at House of Blues in North Myrtle Beach. She was enrolled in cosmetology school, studying to become a stylist. The Tilted Kilt is kind of like Hooters. It's a restaurant that has kind of mediocre food and the girls are in really small costumes. I'd rather French kiss a skunk than go into a place like that just because I feel for the girls. Just, working in the casinos, singing as much as I have, you have to put up with a lot. I'm glad the girls make good money there. They get good tips apparently and they earn them. So Heather is working at one of these places and she notices this man, Sidney Moorer, who is someone that comes to the restaurant on occasion, not only as a customer, but because he is a commercial kitchen equipment repair person. Sidney was 37 years old at the time and Heather was 18, so okay. That's a big age difference. That's a really big age difference. Heather had a Twitter account and she was very active on that account. One day she tweeted that she had a taste for men who were older. She told her roommate, Bree Worrelman, who was also her co-worker, that she thought Sidney was cute. Heather had actually pointed him out to Bree when he was at the restaurant. Heather actually made some really inappropriate jokes about SAing Sidney, really off-color stuff. And then on July 12th, she tweeted she, quote, had a lot of explaining to do, after which she tweeted, I'm in way too deep, but watch me get deeper. Sidney was married. Everyone knew he was married. He had children. He had a family. That didn't matter to Heather Elvis. It sure as hell didn't matter to Sidney. Soon, everyone at the Tilted Kilt was aware that Heather and Sidney were sleeping together. Sidney would often appear in the restaurant with bagels and coffee for Heather. Heather told people that she and Sidney had actually talked about her becoming a nanny for his kids so that they could be together more often. Sidney and his wife, Tammy, were talking about moving to Florida, and if Heather was their nanny, they could take her with them. Ugh. By September of 2013, the affair had hit some bumps in the road, and Heather tweeted, once upon a time, an angel and a devil fell in love. It did not end well. Shortly after things ended between Sidney and Heather, Sidney's wife, Tammy, found out about the affair, and to say she wasn't happy is putting it mildly. Tammy made Sidney call Heather while she was on the line. She made Sidney tell Heather that he was never going to see her again. He told her she meant nothing to him, that he had used her for sex, and then he texted to Heather intimate photos of he and Tammy together, his wife. This just gets worse and worse, doesn't it? Oh, that's mature. That's normal. That's healthy. Speaking of normal and mature and healthy, every night after Tammy found out about the affair, she would handcuff Sidney to the bed. He had to sleep handcuffed to his own bed to keep Tammy happy. Tammy, let that man go. Girl, let that man go. Do whatever he's going to do. He is no prize. Tammy changed all of the passwords on Sidney's devices to things only she knew, and then she started going everywhere with Sidney. Sidney agreed to all of these things because he wanted to save his marriage. Then, as a final chop off of the old balls, Tammy made Sidney get her name tattooed above his little ding-dong. Tammy. Tammy, if you want that little trash man so bad, there must be something wrong with you. Turns out there is. There's a lot wrong with Tammy. But even with all of this, all of these restrictions and constant monitoring of Sidney, Tammy was not satisfied. She continued to contact Heather Elvis, texting her over and over, things like, hey sweetie, ready to meet the missus? She would threaten to hurt Heather physically and even implied that she was going to kill Sidney because of his relationship with Heather. Heather was genuinely scared of Tammy. She was worried. Tammy even tried to get Heather fired from her jobs. Sidney had once told Heather that Tammy had a boyfriend on the side, but she was mad about Sidney having Heather on the side because he lied about it. Heather tried to talk to Sidney and even told him she wanted to continue their affair, but Sidney told her it was over. Heather then asked him if he could please get Tammy to leave her alone. She said she'd lost payable hours at work because they sent her home early when Tammy wouldn't stop calling the restaurant, tying up the phone line. On November 5th, Sidney and Heather saw each other for the last time. That same day, Heather tweeted, "Hey married fellas, you can either cheat on your wife or murder her. Never both. That's when you get caught." I guess that's a Daniel Tosh joke. Okay. Sidney and Tammy took their 2 kids and left for a Disneyland vacation on November 19th. They were gone until December 11th. Heather's friends say that break was good for her and that she seemed to have genuinely moved on from the affair. But there was a problem. Heather Elvis was putting on weight quickly. She had to ask for a new uniform at work. Friends straight up asked her, "Heather, are you pregnant?" She told them that she had taken a pregnancy test, but that it had come back reading error. On December 17th, Heather Elvis went on a first date with a man named Stephen Schiraldi. They drove around and looked at Christmas lights, and then they went to a parking lot where Stephen taught Heather how to drive his manual shift car. He snapped this photo of Heather driving the car, and then Heather texted it to her father and to her roommates. Stephen dropped Heather off at her Carolina Forest apartment around 1:15 in the morning. He was the last person to see her alive. 20 minutes after leaving her, Heather's cell phone got an incoming call from a payphone. That call lasted 5 minutes. Heather then called her roommate, who was out of state for Christmas. She told her roommate that Sidney had just called her, telling her he was leaving Tammy, and he said, "Come and meet me. I want to see you." Bree, Heather's roommate, who said Heather was hysterical at the time, told her, "Do not go and meet him. Something is up." Heather did not listen to this advice. She left the apartment and went to meet Sidney, and she was never seen again. Sometimes when our own intuition fails us, we really need to pay attention to the people around us that care about us. 2 nights later, after people had begun looking for Heather, her green Dodge Intrepid was found at the Peachtree Landing boat launch along the Waccamaw River about 8 miles from her apartment. The car was locked. Police opened it and found that her phone and her keys and her wallet were all gone. Calls to Heather's phone went unanswered, and no one had any idea where she was. Police pulled her phone records. Her phone had traveled near Augusta Plantation Drive. It then went to Longbeard's, a restaurant, and then a call was placed from Heather's phone to Sidney's cell phone, but that call was not connected. Sidney didn't pick up. 5 minutes later, the phone was back at Heather's apartment. It stayed there for 5 to 6 minutes, and then another call was placed to Sidney's home. This time, he picked up, and there was a 4-minute conversation. Around 3:30 in the morning, the phone was back at Peachtree Landing where the car was found. 3 attempts were made to call Sidney's phone from that location. None of those calls were answered. A final call was made to Sidney, and then the phone travels to the Waccamaw Forest and doesn't move after that. Police pulled Sidney and Tammy's phone records. There wasn't much on them that could help them. Then police find security camera footage of Sidney. He goes into a Myrtle Beach Walmart around 1:12 in the morning. He buys cigars and a pregnancy test. He then walks to a payphone and makes a call. That's the call that comes into Heather Elvis's phone, and he tells her to come and meet with him. Even with all of this evidence, it's not enough to arrest Sidney Moorer or Tammy Moorer. Police didn't even know that Heather was dead. They didn't have a body. They didn't have a crime scene. There was no blood. There was no evidence. So for weeks and then months, the case dragged on. I remember seeing this all over the news. There were a lot of those kind of gotcha reporters that were hanging out outside Sidney and Tammy's house and their workplaces trying to get them to talk to them, to tell them where Heather was. It was a really big story. It was very salacious, because of the affair and everything. The media loves those stories. During the time Heather was missing, the story blew up on social media as well. In fact, 2 men were actually arrested and charged with obstruction of justice because they were posting so much false and misleading information on their social media accounts. And it was costing the police time and resources fielding the phone calls from citizens demanding to know about this false information. People were so worked up and hated Sidney so much, this piece of shit that not only cheated on his wife, but had allowed his wife to terrorize Heather Elvis, who was now missing, that people were threatening Sidney. He claimed that people brandished guns at him. He said people were threatening his family. He even claimed that someone shot at his truck, and he called the police, but when they arrived, they found no evidence of that. On February 21st, the police executed a search warrant at the Moorer residence. After 11 hours of searching the home and the property, both Sidney and Tammy Moorer were arrested and charged with murder, kidnapping, obstruction of justice, and for some reason, 2 counts of indecent exposure. Apparently, they had explicit photos of themselves on their phones that had been taken in public places. Because of course they did. Sidney and Tammy posted bond, and then the court imposed a gag order on all participants in the case because, again, social media was going wild over this case. Now, the strange thing is that Sidney and Tammy had a lot of support. They had waged a social media hate campaign against Heather before she disappeared. They called her a homewrecker and much worse, and a lot of people were really sympathetic to Tammy. Then the Moorers were charged with Medicaid fraud. That's a totally different story. They go back to jail and they're there for almost a year. Tammy's mom puts up her home as collateral, and then they posted a $100,000 bond on the murder charges. Finally, the trial begins, but it was a circus. The first trial in June of 2016 ended in a hung jury, a mistrial. At a second trial, Sidney was convicted of only the obstruction of justice charge, and he was sentenced to 10 years in prison. In April of 2018, both Sidney and Tammy were indicted on a single count of conspiracy to kidnap. Then Tammy went on trial for Heather's actual disappearance and murder. This trial could be its own episode. Tammy is bonkers. The things that she does and says are just she's just bonkers. After an 11-day trial, Tammy Moorer was convicted and sentenced to 30 years to run concurrently with time served. In September of 2019, Sidney was also found guilty of kidnapping Heather Elvis, and he was also sentenced to 30 years. Heather Elvis' body has never been found, and no one has been convicted of her murder. This is a tragic case all the way around. No, Heather shouldn't have been sleeping with a married man. He shouldn't have been sleeping with her. But she certainly did not deserve to die, to have her life stolen from her for that poor judgment. She did not deserve to be harassed and tormented, and she did not deserve to be killed. I hope for the sake of her family that she is found so they have the opportunity to gain some closure on this terrible event.
As we always do on this playlist, we talk about the food from the case. So today I drove down to Las Vegas to give you a little bit of a tour of the Tilted Kilt that is at the Link Promenade right off the Strip in Las Vegas. This is the Tilted Kilt, obviously not the same one that Heather Elvis worked at. Like I said earlier, they're kind of like a Hooters. The food is kind of bar food, and then the girls wear little outfits. It's very much like what you would expect. Lots of TVs, lots of sports going on. It's loud. The bar is in the center of the room. This one's actually 2 stories. It's a lot bigger than I thought it was because of that second story, but it's a good sized place. The menu is exactly what you would think it would be. Salads and sandwiches, things like that. I brought the bestie today. He started off with a cup of soup. I asked for a house salad. They brought me a Caesar, but it wasn't too bad. I would never normally order a salad in a place like this, but I'm trying so hard to be good. So hard. The bestie got the salmon. It came with vegetables and mashed potatoes. And I thought it was okay. The vegetables, I ate some of his vegetables. He doesn't eat anything green. He's morally opposed. I got the wings. I've had better wings. They were okay. They needed more sauce. They were a little rubbery, which is, not the way I like my wings, but they were all right. Again, it's just really kind of run-of-the-mill bar food in these places. I think if you're looking for somewhere fun to go, the Tilted Kilt might be, a nice place to watch a ball game or something like that. It's a really beautiful location at the one here in Las Vegas, but mostly I think people are there to flirt with the girls. It's kind of a fun little place in a fun location. I'm sure Myrtle Beach is no different. And sadly, it will just always be connected to the disappearance of this beautiful young girl who, maybe she made some mistakes, but she certainly did not deserve what happened to her. And again, I want to send my love to everyone that was affected by her loss.
Thank you for joining me today on Dining with Death. Hit the like button if you liked the video and subscribe to my channel if you want to support me. You can also support me by joining my Patreon. Stay safe, my friends, and be kind to each other. And I'll see you next time on Dining with Death. Bye.